Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled ScottMadden's Energy Industry Update, as Yogi Berra might say. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. For best results in viewing this presentation, we recommend using a wired high-speed internet connection, as wireless connections can be unpredictable. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. Following the presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period. You may submit your questions at any time using the interface on your screen. Now, I'd like to turn the floor over to our moderator, Stuart Pearman, partner and energy practice leader. Stuart, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you, PJ, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate your choosing to spend some time with us. Our energy utility industry experts are going to work to make this webinar insightful and interesting and maybe have a surprise or two along the way. The webinar is drawn from our recently released ScottMadden Energy Industry Update. It goes out to about 10,000 industry leaders like you. One CEO said, "I look forward to it. I read every word." Our aspiration for the update is that it helps you anticipate what's coming, react to what's changing, and succeed in our changing industry environment. We always have a theme, and so this update is themed as Yogi might say, and as the great philosopher Yogi Berra might say, you got to be careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. And thinking about the future, he might say, it's not too far, it just seems like it is. Of course, and only Yogi could say this, he also said, I didn't really say everything I said, so let's get started. Today's webcast can't cover every topic that's in the update. For that, you'll have to hit the link that PJ will mail out this afternoon. That's also on our last slide. Go to our website and view it there or download it. Please do. The price is right. It's free. Instead of the whole update, we've chosen 3 topics for you. Sean Lowry, a partner, will talk about nuclear challenges and responses. Chris Vlahopoulos, Chris V, partner and clean tech and sustainability practice leader, will talk about the duck curve. And Rick Starkweather, partner and regulatory practice leader, will talk about federal and state jurisdictions and the increasingly blurry line between the two. Helping us in the background as we answer questions will be Greg Leitra, partner and energy clean tech and sustainability research leader. Before I turn it over to Sean, I just want to mention one thing. We have an upcoming fact-finding trip to Australia for utility executives. We're doing this in partnership with SEPA, the Smart Electric Power Alliance. Australia is pretty interesting from a distributed generation perspective. I guess 1 in 7 homes there has rooftop solar. We've had trips in the past to Germany, Hawaii, Texas. They've all been pretty interesting, and so we'll also provide a link if you have any interest in that. So with that, let me turn it over to Sean Lowry. Sean, can you please tell us about nuclear challenges and responses, please?
Yes, thank you, Stuart. If you've been following the nuclear power industry the past several years, you would have heard about the growth in the international region and domestically a mix of new reactors being constructed and some plants announcing premature closing due to economic conditions. Currently, there are 444 operating reactors worldwide, with 63 reactors planned in 15 countries. Energy security concerns and greenhouse gas constraints on coal burning have combined with the basic economics that have been the primary drivers to nuclear power being back on the agenda for projected new capacity in many countries. In the U.S., Tennessee Valley Authority, SCANA, and Southern Nuclear are building new reactors that are currently under construction or recently operationalized with a gross electric capacity output of approximately 5,600 megawatts. To put the trend of U.S. reactors in perspective of international trends, the U.S. currently has 22% of the world's operational reactors, but only 3% of the new build reactors. This has some significant implications for the shortage of experience and knowledge for craft workers and engineering personnel to operate and maintain the existing U.S. nuclear fleet as well as future reactors. On the flip side of the optimism of nuclear reactors domestically, In the next 5 years, the industry is facing 3 key challenges: declining revenues, elevated costs, and ambiguous value of nuclear power in the marketplace. The first challenge, decreasing revenues. Low natural gas prices, challenging capacity markets, and weak carbon price signals are putting pressure on existing nuclear plants, especially in competitive markets. For elevated costs, as the second challenge, industry-wide total electric generating costs have increased approximately 30% from 2002 to 2014. Fuel costs have increased 25%, capital expenditures by a whopping 109%, and operating costs by 13% in 2014 per megawatt hour dollars. And the third challenge, ambiguous value. Under the Clean Power Plan and various other existing state and federal policies, the clean energy produced by nuclear power plants is not valued. In California, the shifting operational characteristics associated with the change in load profile have incentivized resources capable of responding to those signals by reallocating value away from the always-on baseload generation attributed to nuclear power. Say, for example, Diablo Canyon. And finally, premature retirements. So taken together, these trends have caused approximately about 6.8 gigawatts of announced retirements, with more predicted to come as relicensing deadlines approach unless the market environment changes. Over the past 5 years, you'll see 14 reactors have been prematurely closed or have been announced for premature retirement. So how is the industry responding? Well, the industry is responding in 3 distinct ways. First of all, advocating for policy solutions to clarify the value of nuclear power as a safe, reliable, carbon-free source of generation. You'll hear more about that topic in this webinar by my colleague Rick Starkweather. The second way the industry has launched a project approximately 1 year ago to reduce operating costs and keep nuclear costs competitive with other sources of generation. And the third response has been to decommission unprofitable plants as a last resort. And you'll see a summary on the right side of the plants that have been closed. Let's transition to the next topic for some recent market reform policies which have impacted the U.S. nuclear power industry. With a lack of federal policy solutions, state policymakers in New York and Illinois have responded to proposing 2 ratepayer financial solutions to keep domestic power plants online in these 2 states, and they've had very different outcomes. In New York, the Clean Energy Standard policy passed, which impacts 3 sites or 4 nuclear reactors and provides approximately $250 million to $400 million in annual subsidies for the upstate New York power plants. Interestingly, the policy solution did not include Indian Point, which is located just north of New York City. And some experts feel that this is due to political pressure from the state governor administration. You compare New York's policy with the policy proposed in Illinois, which was targeted to financially assist 3 nuclear units. The bill did not pass and had an estimated lower ratepayer impact of approximately $0.25 per ratepayer. If you look at the details of the calculations of both these financial assistance policies, you'll see they're quite complex. If we could transition to the next topic, which is how is the industry responding to increasing costs? As I mentioned earlier, the industry kicked off a coordinated effort to reduce operating, maintenance, capital, and fuel costs called Delivering the Nuclear Promise, which is focused on maintaining operational focus, improving efficiency, and increasing value, with the result of reducing all-in nuclear costs by 30% by the year 2020. We've been involved at the industry level and with specific operators, and we were initially skeptical at first because industry efforts like this have historically fizzled out. However, this effort is significantly different. It has numerous leaders and individual contributors, right from experienced people who've been in the industry 30 or 40 years, all the way down to individual contributors who are new to this industry and are focused on making the industry more cost competitive without compromising safety. The way the industry is doing that is they're focusing primarily on streamlining administrative processes and implementing innovative technologies. We've assisted operators with both of these initiatives that have returned significant cost reductions and returns for them. We've highlighted 3 projects on the left-hand side of the page that you'll see, which we were involved with streamlining various operators' routine processes and delivered dollar savings to improve the reputation of these operators within the industry. In fact, one of these projects was recognized internationally as the world's leading practice. These processes focus on emergency response and radiological monitoring, completing maintenance and surveillance work orders, and managing and overseeing routine outages. The final topic I was planning to cover on this industry response is which is decommissioning unprofitable nuclear power plants as a last resort. We looked at decommissioning as a last resort in 2 simple areas. It's extremely expensive to decommission a nuclear unit, and they take a long time to go through the decommissioning process, whether that's either through the decommissioning process, which is brownfielding a plant, or through the safe store process, which are both specific terms to the NRC. The NRC is still figuring out both of these, and they're tweaking and revising it, which makes it complicated for the operators, and the industry is adding additional fees to the federal decommissioning fund. When a plant is decommissioning, our experience has had informed that there are 3 key areas the licensees need to consider. The first is how the operator transitions the skill sets of their workforce from people who are familiar with operating a reactor to actually decommissioning and demolishing a unit. The mix and skill set is significantly different. We're into more of a project-based focus rather than operations focus. The second area is how the workload actually changes during decommissioning. The technical transition required for the unit is significant, and its evolutions and the work that the workforce does, they don't do routinely. For example, moving fuels from fuel canisters or draining systems within the primary or secondary side of the reactor. In some instances, the workforce remains the same. The workload remains the same, but people who are used to performing that work are no longer around. Take, for example, radiological and environmental monitoring. You're still going to have to monitor that plant. However, that expertise might not be there. And finally, the third area is managing the regulatory process and community stakeholders. The attention units to ensure decommissioning process and the financial spend is adhered to as an operator, and the decommissioning rules adhering to that decommissioning fund require some significant attention and should not be undertaken lightly. So to summarize, nuclear power plant decommissioning, we have projects that are decommissioning a nuclear reactor. Has an uncertain time to complete. It's very expensive to complete, and in the short term, we might have a significant increase in the number of plants that are required to go through this process and demolition. So the drain on the workforce is going to be quite significant, we think, over the next few years, if that's the trend. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share our insights of this area of the energy industry with you today. And I'll turn it back over to Stuart.
Thank you, Sean. You know, we started out saying, quoting Yogi Berra, if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. So much of our successful nuclear industry is hanging in the balance, and it's really uncertain how this is going to turn out. So thanks for sharing that. With that, let's turn it over to Chris Vlahopoulos, Chris V. Chris is going to talk about revisiting the duck curve. We took a lot of actual data and analyzed it in some different ways and found some surprises. Chris?
Thank you, Stuart. as Stuart mentioned today, I'm going to speak about our recent analysis of the duck curve. If you've been around the discussion of renewable energy over the past several years, you could not avoid hearing about the duck curve. In 2013, the California ISO did an analysis and projected what impact variable generation might have on the load that would be required to be supplied by conventional generation. And what they found was the result was a clear dip in daytime minimum loads and steeper ramps. And the chart, as people observed, looks a little bit like a duck, and the belly of the duck with the daytime loads and the steepness of the ramps with the neck. It's become a staple of conferences and has been used by many as evidence for various positions, including the need for systems to manage an increasingly distributed grid. And in some ways, the interpretations of this simple chart have become accepted and rehashed without really questioning the data behind it. Does it really mean what we think it means? In even some simple terms, if you look at the chart, as we did when we started looking at it, you notice it's a snapshot of one day in March, a day in March, with actuals through 2013 and projections through 2020. At ScottMadden, we wondered, if you really looked at the data, are the projections coming true in reality? And when you look at the underlying data, the hour-to-hour, day-to-day, season-to-season, is it a consistent story, or is there any insights we could gain? So as Stuart mentioned, we scraped hourly data from 2011 to 2016 and started with, could we replicate 2012 to get ourselves confident that we had the right data set? We did. And then we began to slice and dice it and look at it from various angles. So first we found that, in fact, yes, the duck curve is real and growing as fast or faster than expected. We're going to walk you through a little chart here. What this chart shows, we picked a day in March with the lowest daytime net load. As you recall, that duck curve chart was described as March 31st. So we looked for a day in March as the worst case scenario, and we picked the lowest daytime minimum net load to see what would be the worst case in March. So what you see now is 2011 and 2012, not so much like a duck. If you look now, you start bringing in 2013. It starts, you can see we're starting to see lower and steeper. 2014, a little more pronounced. 2015, a little bit of a lull in the progress. And then 2016 continues the progression with lowest of the experienced loads and the steepest of the necks. So again, progressively getting worse, coming true generally as predicted, and the belly is lower and ramps are steeper. One thing you will note is the shape characteristics are a little different. The head of the duck in the original chart continues to grow and move later in the day. This doesn't demonstrate that. We're not sure whether it's because we cherry-picked a date and not read in too much, or it may be because of energy efficiency is shaping the shape of the demand, but it does demonstrate. So it's noteworthy that the belly of the duck in 2016 is significantly lower than forecast in the original chart. Daytime loads dipping below 14,000 megawatts compared to around 15,000 found in the forecast. So yes, what was forecast is coming true. And then we asked the question, well, is that only happening on some select days in March? So we took data and said, if you look beyond the worst day in March and looked at the distribution of those daytime minimum net loads as well as the ramps, you'll see that they are in fact getting worse as well. So what these charts show is for 365 days out of the year, for 3 select years, 11, 13, and 15. We didn't put all the years so it wouldn't get too difficult to read the charts. It shows the distribution of both minimum load and the late day 3-hour ramps across those 365. And again, on the left, we define daytime minimum net load as the hours between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. so that we could try and find the belly of the duck rather than maybe an overnight minimum. In 2013, very few days had daytime minimum net loads of 20,000, but by 2015, roughly half of the year had such minimums. And on the right, we have the late day 3-hour ramp. Again, we define this as the steepest 3-hour ramp between 2 p.m. and 9 p.m. at the period that we're interested in. It represents the neck of the duck. In 2015, the 3-hour ramp exceeded 5,000 megawatts, 58% of the year, up from 6% in 2011. So again, the net loads are getting lower and more frequent, and the heavy ramps are getting more and more frequent. So again, it's not just March, but increasing in the number of days and severity. But so then we looked as days and seasons. Are we seeing it all the time? Is there anything we can learn? It's not occurring uniformly across the year. If you look at this chart, shows weekdays versus weekends. The lines you're seeing now are weekdays, and now the blue are weekends. And you'll see a different behavior as you might expect. Again, this chart shows an average over the whole year. It's not as bad as if we had picked worse days on a weekend or worse days on a weekday. But you see the duck curve effect is more pronounced on the weekends. The 3-hour ramp on weekends was 10% steeper than weekdays. And I think this makes sense. You'd assume that weekends are more prone to experience the impact because of their lower demand that you might see. So the next thing we looked at is, it's March. Do we see the same? Is it only March? So we looked at seasonality. So what you're seeing now is March. But in fact, we found that December of that next year, December 2015, has shown a more pronounced behavior than March of 2015. So the green line now you're seeing is December. So it's not just a spring phenomenon. But if you look at September and June, you see that it is less of an issue in those time periods, probably again because of the greater demand during those time periods. As you know, summer and early fall, not as prevalent, but when you get into the March and December time frames, those are the periods where we begin to see the biggest impact. The biggest thing we found when we looked at this was what is driving the duck curve. When we looked at the data, it challenged a fundamental interpretation of the cause of the duck curve and showed that it was not distributed resources solely being the driver of this phenomenon. There's some who make the leap of faith that because we hear about a lot of distributed solar in California, that's what's causing it. So to help explain that, we need to understand, we've got to go back to when the duck curve presents data, what is it really presenting? And it's presenting what is defined as net load. And it's critical to understand how that differs total load, system load, and net load. Total load is that which needs to be served by any form of generation, central station or distributed. When you remove the effects of distributed generation, you have system load that the California ISO is responsible for managing, and that can be served by either utility scale variable or utility scale traditional dispatchable power. Net load is the load that's left after the variable generation, and that must be served and dispatched by the ISO. So again, if you look at the chart, the green slice would be the distributed generation, the blue slice would be the intermittent utility scale, and the gray would be what has to be served by the traditional dispatchable generation. So what does this mean? If we take a look at system load, which includes utility scale solar, utility scale wind, utility scale traditional generation, California's average system load looks very different than the duct. As compared to Hawaii on the right, you're beginning to see, even in system load, an appearance of a duct. We take this to mean that what's driving the duct behavior in California has a heavy component of utility scale generation, solar in particular. But again, that's a caveat. It's not to say that distributed solar isn't having an effect, and it's not to say that it won't have a greater effect later, or that in other parts of the country, like Hawaii, it's not an issue. But we caution against making a simple leap of logic that the duct curve implies a solely DER problem and solely DER solutions. So what does all of this mean? I think in summary, if you look at the duct curve with the underlying data, you'll see that none of what we've shown you today is at all inconsistent with what was presented by the iconic duct curve. Instead, when we see things like this, we just need to be careful in how we make conclusions about it. And when you have visibility into the data, you can have a greater understanding. We found that yes, in fact, it's coming true as predicted with a few twists, and we've talked about those. But also, if we understand the drivers, we can better address them. So a weekend seasonal utility scale problem has solution options that may be different than if it were solely a distributed problem more uniformly seen during the year. And as important, the one takeaway as well is you're not immune to the effects just because you have little rooftop solar. For areas of the country that have growing utility scale solar, it may very well pose a risk sooner rather than later. So Stuart, thank you for the time. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Chris. So what we've learned is ducts are real. We've learned that ducts are different. You know, you see a lot of use of the Hawaii duct curve and the California duct curve interchangeably, but those are different ducts. They have different causes and different solutions. And what that means is that ducts will migrate. For those that thought that ducts were just coming from rooftop solar, that they're just on the roof, that's not true. We've learned that utility scale solar is the principal cause in California. And so there are a lot of other states where utility scale solar is growing, but distributed solar is not. And so ducts could be coming to a system near you. With that, and thanks, Chris. With that, let's turn it over to Rick Starkweather. Rick, can you tell us where the line is between the feds and the states, please? Just draw the line, tell us, and then we'll be done.
Thanks, Stuart. Well, we'll certainly give it a try. The last topic we're going to cover today is around the emerging federal and state policy friction that's resulting from various state-level policy initiatives that appear to be blurring the lines between state and federal jurisdictional authority. The information on this topic that's included in our fall energy industry update builds on some of the content that was contained in the spring EIU, where we discussed how the FERC and certain states were testing the boundaries of their traditional jurisdictions. Specifically, how proposed policy initiatives from the FERC around compensation levels for demand response resources, and from Maryland and New Jersey around compensation for other generation sources to incentivize investment might be impacting price formation in the wholesale markets. These initiatives continue to cause heated debate between all of the affected stakeholders, with appeals all the way to the Supreme Court. To set the stage, I'd like to start with a brief recap on how we got to where we are today. When FERC restructured the power industry back in 1996 through Order 888, it disintegrated wholesale generation and transmission, helped to stand up new regional RTOs and ISOs, and established mechanisms for market-based rates. Its objective? To unleash market forces to help drive down prices in an inherently competitive power generation sector. Unfortunately, over the past 20 years, the restructuring journey has not been without some bumps in the road and some growing pains. With the economic obsolescence of many generating units, as Sean described earlier, the shifts in generation fuel mix, and the more recent dash to gas, energy market price spikes, lower capacity prices, and the attendant financeability challenges for merchant generators, and the merchant generation boom and bust. To address some of these shortcomings, pure energy-only markets have been adjusted over time through a number of administrative, what I'll call rule-based mechanisms, including price caps to protect the interests of ratepayers, primarily in the newly formed markets, minimum offer price rules to align incentives for market participants, administratively drawn demand curves to maintain resource adequacy, capacity markets to provide additional compensation to suppliers to address what's been termed the missing money problem created by the original price caps, and very recently, capacity performance products to ensure that capacity bid into the market is actually available when called upon. But while these new mechanisms are generally working to lower prices for consumers, some believe the markets are still not properly valuing baseload generation. The nation's organized electricity markets now serve about 2/3 of the U.S. population. Unlike certain regions like the Southeast, where vertically integrated utilities still own the power system, non-utility independent power producers actively participate in these organized markets. Without reforms, utilities are concerned that the low prices of natural gas and renewable energy that we're experiencing today will continue to push higher cost coal and nuclear plants to shut down in these organized markets, leaving the grid vulnerable to price spikes and reliability issues as our fuel diversity narrows and hurting decarbonization efforts. Exelon's recent announcement that it would retire 2 uncompetitive nuclear plants in Illinois after a subsidy proposal earlier this year failed to pass the legislature is a good example. So just how are the states asserting their interests in these matters? The Federal Power Act clearly splits authority among states, utilities, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. In that regard, states regulate generation facilities and retail utility power purchases, but may not set wholesale rates. Wholesale energy sellers set their own prices, and FERC has exclusive jurisdiction to review them and determine their legality. By definition, states have some overlapping but additional interests other than the just and reasonable rates principle that governs federal oversight. But increasingly, states are expanding their involvement in areas that touch upon energy while trying to manage specific outcomes, such as expanding and incentivizing renewables and distributed energy resources, suppressing price increases and volatility for state residents and businesses, encouraging generation development and retention of existing power plants, and implementing environmental and carbon policies that may very well differ from their neighboring states. To these ends, the states have introduced various approaches to advance their agendas, which, if all implemented, could create a hybrid market system and potentially work counter to federally approved market design. There is a range of policy options for the energy markets between a pure market approach and a pure centrally planned approach, as has been historically applied. We are now trying to combine these concepts in very unanticipated ways, and this may produce unintended consequences. In the EIU, we describe 3 recent state actions that are drawing this state-federal conflict into focus. The first refers to a recent FERC complaint filed by 2 electric cooperatives in Maryland. Maryland recently implemented a set of pilot community solar regulations. In those regulations, the local utilities must use the excess community solar generation and compensate the provider at retail rates. The proposed regulation applies to cooperatives as well as investor-owned utilities. Utilities are arguing that since they can only use excess community solar generation by reselling it to customers, this constitutes a wholesale sale and is thus subject to the Federal Power Act. As such, the community solar generator must be a qualifying facility, or QF. So the community solar generation offtake should be at wholesale avoided cost rates per PURPA, not retail rates per the Maryland proposal. This complaint is still pending before FERC, but it could very well implicate issues that led to Order 745 regarding the demand response compensation proposed by FERC, which was upheld by the Supreme Court earlier this year. In that decision, the court stated that FERC can regulate wholesale markets and other matters directly affecting wholesale rates, even if this affects, even substantially, the quantity or terms of retail sales. So in effect, the court may have been moving the bright line between federal and state regulation a little bit closer to the federal side of the property line, so to speak. Next, we provide an update on the proposed generation subsidy plans in Ohio. Back in March, the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio unanimously approved an 8-year subsidy plan with income guarantees for utilities for their share of the output from certain vital power plants, largely aging coal plants, that face economic challenges due to low prices and decreasing demand. In that proposal, costs would be recovered through a non-bypassable distribution rider charge that would be assessed to all end-use customers. In this case, competing power suppliers have challenged that these guarantees could possibly distort wholesale prices if these units are bid into the market. Again, this is still pending before FERC, with a decision expected in early 2017. In the interim, however, FERC is requiring a PPA filing from these utilities and specific approval of those PPAs before the program can be implemented. FERC is also alleging expressing some concerns over potential benefits transfers from captive customers to shareholders through the PPAs. This situation appears to be very similar to the Maryland plan recently rejected by the Supreme Court, but we'll have to watch this one play out. The third example is the Clean Energy Standard in New York. As described by Sean Laurie earlier, New York has proposed awarding zero emissions credits to certain nuclear plants, rewarding their carbon-free characteristics and incenting them to remain online. As defined in the Commission's order, ZECs are based upon the federal social cost of carbon, carbon emissions credit values, and an avoided energy cost based upon a forecast $39 per megawatt hour reference price. Several power suppliers and fossil fuel providers oppose the plan and have filed suit in federal court, claiming it will suppress prices in the New York ISO market. The complaint points to the U.S. Supreme Court's decision last year in Hughes versus Talon Energy Marketing that FERC's jurisdictional authority over wholesale markets preempts state regulators' desire to pair such subsidies with wholesale rates. Some observers believe that the ZECs will pass muster because they do not specifically adjust the wholesale rate, but rather reward a clean attribute like other emissions credit schemes. As Sean mentioned earlier, Illinois' Next Generation Energy Plan, which sought similar subsidies for nuclear generation earlier this year, failed to pass the legislature. But a very recent article in Cranes suggests that Exelon is proposing a revised bill to the legislature that will incorporate a social cost of carbon measurement to help determine the subsidy levels like the proposed New York approach. While the states, FERC, and the courts have been busy conceiving and evaluating these different solutions, the markets have also been looking at potential adjustments to their market mechanisms. Back in August, PJM unveiled a proposed approach to deal with these types of subsidized capacity. In short, the proposal attempts to bolster capacity prices by acting as if these subsidized units had not participated in the auction. They're proposing a two-stage process. In stage one, they would remove any subsidized capacity and commensurate demand before executing the capacity auction mechanism. In stage two, once the auction was completed, they would reinsert the subsidized capacity and commensurate demand at a predetermined reference price approximating each source's going forward costs. The proposed benefits of this new plan: subsidized resources would not receive revenues from the capacity market, thus potentially increasing the subsidy cost for the associated public policy regions, but in turn incenting the suppliers to pull themselves out of the auction. Anticipated drawbacks: the reference price of certain subsidized resources in stage two could be lower than the clearing price determined in stage one, yet those resources would be prevented from securing a capacity commitment in the auction. There are certainly many details yet to be worked out, and some significant questions that PJM will likely address going forward include: what's deemed subsidized? Is it simply baseload coal or baseload nuclear units as proposed in Illinois and in New York and in Ohio, or are other potential generation sources also going to be included in this process? And lastly, how will these reference prices be determined? So what are the implications of these proposals? The various market mechanisms and responses have potentially created a hybrid system. Recent Supreme Court decisions have been very narrowly tailored to avoid categorically affording federal or state primacy, i.e. in Hughes versus Talon Energy Marketing, by not rejecting, quote, other measures states might employ to encourage development of new or clean generation. In that decision, the court specifically cited that such proposals needed to be untethered from wholesale market participation. Unfortunately, these proposals have also had the effect of making the so-called bright line between state and federal jurisdiction harder to see. So, Stuart, perhaps I'm not responding to your initial request. Very specifically, the uncertainty about whether state policies or incentives cross into FERC regulatory turf is likely going to lengthen lead time and increase risks and related costs for power resource investments, exactly what the states are trying to combat. In closing, we think the federal and state policy friction we are seeing today will continue for the foreseeable future. Stuart Pearman has a great analogy. The supposed bright line between federal and state energy policy is like the property line between you and your neighbor. As long as neither party is near the line, you don't really care. But as policy proposals get more aggressive, or that new tool shed your neighbor is planning looks like it is going to be right on the property line, your level of interest increases significantly. I'm sure we will all continue to watch these developments closely. Stuart?
Thank you, Red, for sharpening our view of that really blurry line. So thank you all for sending in questions, and now we're going to field some of your questions. Here's one for Sean. Sean, this one's about the relicensing cliff, and the question is, so what impact will that have? The relicensing cliff, meaning all these licenses are fixing to expire in the next 20 or 30 years. So what would the impact of that be?
So thanks, Stuart. So as you're aware, we've built a number of these nuclear power plants in the late 60s and 70s, and they have a license expiration of 40 years or could be relicensed for an additional 20 years. So by 2030, after that 60-year mark, approximately 23% of the current nuclear generation, around 23,000 megawatts, which represents about 2.2% of total U.S. total generating capacity, could be gone as a result of that relicensing cliff. And the states that are most impacted by that are New York, Texas, and Illinois. And it could be by 2045, based on current license expiration dates, about 85 gigawatts or 87 units. And that represents about 88% of current installed U.S. generating capacity, or 18% of 2015 net generation. So it's quite significant.
Thank you, Sean. Here's a question for Chris. Chris, we were talking earlier that one of your findings was that ducks can migrate. And so the question is, could they migrate all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Germany? And if they get there or have gotten there, how's Germany handling it?
It's a good question, and I think we also got a question about how's California handling it. So it sort of speaks to the, how do you handle the duck curve? And I think there's really three main strategies for handling the duck curve. One is dampen the problem by expanding the interconnections to larger markets. The second is shifting demand, and the third is flexible operations. So in terms of Germany, particularly there, what you see over there is that when there's excess power, they're dumping it to their neighbors. When they need it, you have the French nuclear that can come in and support. Also, they're building transmission lines from the north with wind to connect with the south that has solar. So the whole strategy of making a little bigger market, the analogy there in California is the Western imbalance market and being able to leverage a little bit larger market. Shifting demand is another strategy. Either, Germany doesn't use time of use rates as much as we may here in the U.S., but trying to change the demand either through electric vehicle charging, trying shifting through time of use rates, energy storage as well as we're looking at. And I think thirdly is the flexible operation. And unfortunately, as Sean's mentioned for nuclear, in Germany, they've replaced low emission nuclear with coal. They're burning a lot of coal to create ramping, a little more flexible generation. And we're seeing a little bit of that same issue here in the U.S. With the Diablo Canyon issue. So again, sort of dilute the problem through a larger market and shift demand if you can, and flexible generation sources that can handle those faster ramps.
Thank you, Chris. Rick, here's a question for you. It's about the New York zero emission credits. You mentioned the whole tethering thing, and the blurry line, near as we can tell, is the way you cross it is if you are tethered to wholesale market. So I'm sure this will puzzle the Supreme Court, but tell us the answer. Are the New York zero emission credits tethered to the wholesale markets or untethered? What are the arguments on both sides? What are the puts and takes?
Thanks, Stuart. That's a great question. I think this one's very difficult to call, perhaps in the spirit of recent World Series. This may come down to calling balls versus strikes. In other words, there may be quite a bit of room for interpretation. The umpire's view of the strike zone, so to speak, rather than a definitive rule regarding a foul ball. The recent Supreme Court decision in Hughes versus Talon Energy Marketing, as I described earlier, made it very clear that the Contract for Differences subsidy program proposed in Maryland was preempted by the Federal Power Act, primarily because the proposed program set the rate for capacity sales in the market and thus, quote, adjusted an interstate wholesale rate per the Supreme Court decision. That decision, though, focused on the requirement in Maryland that the units clear the capacity auction. So the first step in the Maryland proposal was the units needed to clear the capacity auction to even be eligible for the subsidies. This potentially directly affects auction results and could provide, theoretically, an economic incentive for those suppliers to bid into the market at much lower prices to ensure that they cleared the first step. Proponents of the plan, of the New York plan, suggest that since the zero emissions credits are based on social cost of carbon, in other words, we're pricing an attribute, they are not tied to market prices. However, because the proposed benefits are capped based on wholesale market price projections, the opponents to the proposal argue that they function very much like the Maryland program. Again, I think we'll all have to sit and watch, see how this plays out in the courts. They may end up calling a ball, or they may end up calling a strike.
Thank you, Rick. Sean, here's a question for you. You talked about the nuclear relicensing cliff before, all these licenses coming up. What about SMRs? Are SMRs going to come to the rescue? What do you see as the future of SMRs?
Stuart, small modular reactors are a terrific opportunity to enable generation to be closer to the load center. However, there's 5 constraints or challenges for mass adoption of small modular reactors as part of the energy mix. First, the regulatory process is still immature around SMRs. Both federal and state governments are still trying to figure out the regulations. The second challenge, as we see it, is security will still need to be maintained. So security around the perimeter of a small modular reactor will still need to be in place. There'll still need to be a security workforce and infrastructure and access to transmission lines, transmission or distribution. The third challenge, as we see it, is siting of these will be significant. Already, no one wants a nuclear power plant in their backyard. Will they want a small modular reactor in their backyard instead? That will be something to be questioned.
Can we put it next to the tool shed that Rick was talking about before?
The fourth, which is not just getting small modular reactors into the ground, but what's the decommissioning process look like of small modular reactors? We're still figuring out and changing how we're doing decommissioning process of large-scale power plants. What's the decommissioning process for small? And then finally, as Chris mentioned, load profile is going to be a big challenge in the industry going forward. Do small modular reactors really give us any flexible advantage to mirror that load profile? And preliminary answer is no. So is that really an advantage? So those are kind of the 5 challenges as we see it with small modular reactors.
Thanks, Sean. Chris, here's one for you. We've been talking about ducks as migratory birds, and so can you tell us where on this side of the pond in the United States are we starting to see duck curve effects appear in other states?
Thanks, Stuart. I think, and given the political season too, I'll pivot as well on this. And there was another question we had about data availability, which speaks to this. Is the nice thing about the California analysis, we actually had data, and someone asked, where else does the data exist? It's difficult to answer that question, but I think with real good data. But I think what you look at is where are the states that are beginning to have a significant amount of solar in their generation mix. And after the paper, we expand that not just to distributed, but to any kind of solar. And so when you look at states like our state of North Carolina, where there's a very large queue of solar being installed, it's an area that I'm sure we'll be looking at to see what that data looks like. I know there's been some projections put out there, but again, if you're looking for that situation, look for capacity of solar to be reaching percentage-wise that which you see in California.
Thank you, Chris. Rick, last questions for you. We talked about the blurry line between the feds and the states on the electricity side, and everybody building tool sheds right next to the property line. Is there anything similar happening on the gas side, or is it all quiet on that front?
Yes, there is, Stuart. As one example, the Constitution Pipeline is a proposed pipeline linking shale gas resources in Pennsylvania to other pipelines in the state of New York. Pipeline's been in the planning stages for quite some time. Various applications have been submitted to the appropriate regulatory authorities, and we're now running into some bumps in the road. FERC typically would have jurisdiction over siting, permitting, and approvals for the pipeline under the Natural Gas Act. However, states also have jurisdiction over environmental matters in collaboration with the EPA, but at the state level have typically approved permits for projects that have gone through the exhaustive FERC approval process, which includes an environmental impact statement. So in the past, if they can successfully make it through the FERC hoops, most states have gone along and approved the permits at their level. In April 2016, which is 2 years after the pipeline's original application to the FERC, New York's Department of Environmental Conservation, perhaps under pressure from local environmental groups, denied a Clean Water Act permit for the pipeline, saying it failed to adequately address potential water impacts. So for Constitution, they made it over the FERC hurdle. Now they're running into a bump in the road at the state level. As you might expect, a federal appeals court hearing has been docketed, with FERC and others likely weighing in, primarily arguing that the Natural Gas Act already balances local and national interests in energy infrastructure development. Gas industry observers have noted, as on the electric side, that such state-level challenges may discourage future investments, delay pipeline development, and lead to possible supply shortfalls and higher prices in pipeline-constrained areas like New England. 3 other New York pipeline projects are dealing with various permitting issues and delays in New York, so the Constitution Pipeline hasn't been singled out. And again, we'll have to watch and see how all this plays out.
Thanks, Rick. And thanks to everyone for spending time with us today. We appreciate it. These are exciting times in our industry. Anything can happen. Who knows? The Cubbies might even win the World Series. Nah. PJ will send out this deck to you guys later today. And if you'd like to receive the full ScottMadden Energy Industry update, she'll have a link for that. And if you're interested in the Australia fact-finding trip, she'll have a link to that. And so please let me turn it over to PJ to close us out. PJ?
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, speakers. Fantastic presentation today. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending. That does conclude today's presentation.